Hi guys, welcome back. Today I'll be talking about my favorite type of coinage, Greek coins. Greek coins are probably one of the most complex types of coins in existence, as there is more than Greeks that are grouped as Greek coins, which I'll be going over today. I'll be going over on what classifies as Greek coins, meaning who is grouped in the category as Greek coins. I did a brief summary on my first video on the first coins ever minted, but I'll be going over that on this video as well. I'll be going over the Archaic period coins, the Classical period, and finally the Hellenistic period, which is my personal favorite and what I personally collect. I have a ton of coins that I'll be showcasing today. These are typically extremely high-end coins, so I can show you guys the apex of what those people minted. So please don't get mad at me for showing you the best of the best coins. I'll also be showcasing a couple of in-hand videos, which is from my personal collection. Just a disclaimer, I am no expert numismatist. I might get some slight errors. I still have much to learn as I've only been in the hobby for less than 2 years. I just wanted to share the wonderful hobby of collecting ancient coins. Now with that said, let's get started. What classifies as a Greek coin is typically as follows. From the earliest coinage, which I will explain soon, to all the way to the death of Cleopatra in 31 BC. Now, I'm going to push that date out to 10 AD. I'll explain that in the Hellenistic section. Now, the exceptions that are not counted as Greek coins are Indian stamp coins, Chinese coins, Celtic coins, and Roman Republican coins before the end of the Hellenistic period. What is included is some very interesting coins, which I'll explain later, as I don't want to spoil it, but they do have some sort of Greek influence. Around 650 BC, on the western half of modern-day Turkey, was the Kingdom of Lydia. They are attested as the ones who minted on what we call the first coins ever minted. Oversimplifying here, but before coins, trade was mainly a barter and direct exchange. They used from anything from food, cattle, bullion, metals, and jewelry. There was an issue with long-distance trading, as it was typically a credit transaction on tablets, and weight standards were also an issue when traveling. The most likely reason on why the Lydians made coins is to make it easier for transactions. Coins offered a standard denomination for both large and small transactions. Since the state minted the coins, they also backed it. Each coin had a standard value you could trust at a glance, so no need to reweigh each piece, which allowed for standardizing, pricing, and accounting. Also, a big reason why it works so well is the use of taxing and to easily pay for military endeavors like campaigns, troops, equipment, and food. Okay, let's look at the first coins ever minted. Not a whole lot you can see here. It just looks like a lump of gold. It actually isn't just gold, it's electrum. Electrum is a mix of both silver and gold. There are debates on if the Lydians combined both metals to make electrum, or they found it this way naturally. I personally lean towards them mixing it, as it'd make a whole lot easier to standardize the weights. And on the reverse has on what we call an incuse punch, which we theorize they purposely did this to prevent counterfeiting. Unfortunately for them, that did not work, and we actually know of ancient counterfeits with the incuse punch. Probably slightly after the first coins, they made these striated lines on the obverse. I find these a lot more appealing than the plain glob of metal on the earlier ones. Numismatists put these types in the same year range as the first type at 650 BC. A few decades later, we started to see images on coins. The one you see now is still minted in the Kingdom of Lydia. Numismatists link it to King Atlantes from around 625 BC. These coins are probably the most famous of the early electrum staters and their denominations. The obverse shows a lion, which is the motif for the Kingdom of Lydia, with some sort of circle-looking thing with what it looks like sun rays coming out of his forehead. Numismatists call this a sunburst. There are 7 known denominations of this type, from the biggest being the stater, which is around 14 grams of electrum, to a tiny 196 stater being a small 0.14 grams. That is crazy. During the same time in the city of Ephesus within the kingdom of Lydia, minted these Phanes staters with the stag grazing. When I was doing research for this video, I found out that these are the first coins ever in conjunction with the other staters that have the motif on the obverse, but these also have the first words ever minted on a coin, which says Phanes in Greek. What I found out when doing research is that there are one of these coins in a jar in the foundations of the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. This is possibly the earliest known hoard of coins in existence. We are not certain who Phanes is, but there are theories who he might be. You can Google it yourself, but because we still have a lot to talk about, I will not be going over it. Now here is probably the most famous of all the Greek coinage. This is the coins of King Croesus from around 560 BC. He was the first one to rid of electrum and use the gold and silver weights, which made it far easier to get good value for the weight because electrum had one big issue, which was the gold to silver ratio, which had a lot of variation on the quality of each coin. So he solved this issue by separating them, thus being the first to use separate metals for coins. I took a photo of Harlan Burke's 100 greatest ancient coins, which I actually highly recommend to get, is pretty cheap, on all the denominations of Croesus. Interestingly, Harlan was the man who figured out the denominations of this type, and now us numismatists use it as a reference for these types. Eventually, Croesus fell to the Persians, which is cool that the Persians adopted the weight standard for their famous Daric and Sigilos coins, which I'll go over in a bit. Some cities did not abandon electrum coinage. Probably the most famous of the bunch is the city of Cyzicus. They minted electrum coins from around 520 BC all the way to 340 BC. They have by far the most diverse types of electrum coinage, as there is around 180 known types, which is crazy. They have anything from animals to mythic animals, gods, and even things like equipment like this Corinthian helmet on screen. How you can tell that they're from the city of Cyzicus is they all have the tunny fish on it, which is the motif of their city. The previous coins are all in the Archaic period, which started in 750 BC and ended in 490 BC with the end of the Greco-Persian Wars. Here's a map of the popular cities of Greece and the Aegean Islands. There are a few later archaic coins that you will see, and probably the most famous of them is the archaic Athens tetradrachm. Athens created one of the most used weight standards that ever existed, which is the Attic standard, which is started around 575 BC all the way to 294 AD with the Roman Emperor Diocletian's economic reform. That is a whopping 845 years, which is crazy to think about. This Athens tetradrachm was minted around 500 BC. The next you will see is the Aegina stater, which is also in the 500s BC. These are very famous as well, with the sea turtle on the early versions to the land tortoise on the later versions, as you can see on the fins or the feet. You will also see the early Corinthian staters, which this is a very famous type as it shows the winged horse Pegasus. The early versions typically does not have Athena on it like the later types. Another you will see is the Poseidonia staters, which has Poseidon holding his trident, which will be a very common stance that a lot of later coins will imitate. The city of Poseidonia is in Magna Graecia, which is in modern-day Italy. Interestingly, Magna Graecia coins will have what it looks like the same die on the reverse, but in fact that these are actually not the same die as on the obverse. The last archaic coins I'll be talking about is the Persian Daric and Sigilos. These were minted for a few hundred years, and the one I'm showing you now is minted around 500 BC to 480 BC by Darius the First or Xerxes. And here is an absolute beautiful one minted right before Alexander campaigned into Persia a few hundred years later. Now let's move on to the classical period. The map you see is unfortunately still in the archaic period. I tried to find a map of the classical period, but there was not a lot of maps that I found that I could use without getting the video flagged as copyright, but at least it shows a bunch of main city-states in both the Aegean and Magna Graecia. Now here is an auction that happened in 2023 that has one of the best selection of Greek coins that I've ever seen. Now I know that there are equal if not better auctions that happened previously, but I wanted to show you the diverse world of classical coins. There are some archaic and Hellenistic coins that are mixed in here as well, but a majority of these are classical. These are tiny pieces of peak artistry. As you can see, the coins have gods on both side profile and slightly facing with exquisite detail. You also see mythological scenes, both real and mythological animals, plants, musical instruments, food like grains and grapes, you name it. And this is typically in a high relief, which means that the artwork kind of pops out of the coin, which makes it 3D looking. That is why I think classical Greek coins are the most unique area of coinage ever, but they also command the highest prices. Now I will start with the most famous ancient coin ever, the Athens tetradrachm. This style is the one that you will see in most collections. I may be oversimplifying here as it's not my expertise, but after the Persian Wars, there was a confederation of city-states that formed the Delian League. As you can see on the map in blue, Athens was the hegemon. This made Athenians very rich, as they also had access to the silver mines, and they started pumping out these tetradrachms out by the millions till around 404 BC. They needed money to pay for their massive navy and troops in the wars that followed, like the Peloponnesian War and the massive defeat at Sicily. Just for perspective, there was an estimate of 14 million tetradrachms that were minted during that time, and around 200,000 to 500,000 still survive today. Just about every auction that offers Greek silver coins will have at least one of these for auction. Even non-ancient coin collectors will have one of these in their collections, as they are that famous. Most Athens tetradrachms do not have the full die on the obverse, and collectors will pay a massive premium for the full crest on Athena's plume on her helmet, like the one that you're seeing right now. These were so popular that other civilizations started imitating them. Here's an imitation in Egypt. We don't know who minted these, as it was still under Persian rule. Numismatists speculate they made these to pay for Greek mercenaries. Another you'll see is in the Palestine region, which they look very faithful to the real Athenian tetradrachms, and even tribes in Arabia minted them. They tend to look a little different, and they typically have this thunderbolt-looking symbol on Athena's cheek. It just shows you how widespread the trade and how powerful Athens was, and how popular the style were for these types of coins. Okay, let's move on to the city of Syracuse in Sicily. This city was one of the most important cities in the whole Mediterranean due to its great geographical location. The city went through a ton, from many wars to the constant back and forth between democracies and tyrants, and it still prospered. Only a few hundred years after the birth of coinage, Syracuse produced arguably the most gorgeous coins that ever existed. They had some of the best master die engravers that produced some truly incredible coins. By far the most famous is their tetradrachms and even bigger decadrachms. These coins are so grand that people even in ancient times kept them as a national treasure. These coins were kept in collections since they were produced, thus a lot of them still survive today in excellent condition. The most famous die engravers were Euenatos and Kimon. They signed their dies on their coins. This is all around the end of the 400s BC. Interestingly, you can tell they are coins from Syracuse because of the quadriga, or the charioteer with 4 horses, is on the obverse, while the water nymph Arethusa, who was the patron deity of Syracuse, was on the reverse. These coins are some of the most sought-after coins in all of Greek coinage, and maybe in all of coinage in general. They are truly spectacular. There are many great coins minted during this period, but let's move on to the city of Naxos. Not the Naxos in the Aegean, but north of Syracuse. They minted some amazing drams during the Archaic period, which I did not mention, but they truly peaked during the same time as the Syracuse coins I mentioned previously. Their patron deity was Dionysus due to the fertile land which they had many vineyards to produce wine. Dionysus was accompanied by his followers, the satyrs, which are usually drunk and ready to go, as you can see. There are a couple of absolute masterpieces that are notable of mention. They tend to fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars in auctions. The next and last of the classical period is a Greek settlement on the far reaches of the Black Sea in the city of Pantikapaon in modern-day Crimea and Ukraine. Pretty neat that the Greeks were all the way up north on quote-unquote the end of civilization. They were under constant threat of the nomadic tribes like the Scythians and Sarmatians. Their patron deity is, well, Pan, which is pretty a rare sight to see on coins. The city must have thrived because they minted some amazing coins. These absolutely beautiful coins were minted during the end of the classical period and into the Hellenistic. They typically have Pan on the obverse and a griffin on the reverse. You'll most likely see the side profile bust of Pan, but there are these very rare three-quarter facing ones. Almost all of them are in museums except for one as far as I know. And that coin is the most expensive ancient coin that ever sold, which hammered for $4.9 million in 2023. That doesn't even include the 25% buyer's premium. Pantikapaon minted gold, silver, and bronze. The silver coins are pretty uncommon compared to the others, but they all tend to be in pretty good condition. And the bronze tends to be in pretty inexpensive, considering all things, so if you're pretty interested in getting one, I highly recommend it. Alright, let's wrap this up with the Hellenistic period. This is more my expertise, so I'm going to spend a little bit extra time on it. The Hellenistic age started when Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. His generals and bodyguards, called the Diadochi, fought over his empire. When Alexander plundered the Persian Empire, he gained and redistributed a massive amount of wealth, and his successors needed to pay for their troops and ultimately many wars that followed after his death. Here's my coin. It's a tetradrachm of Alexander. The obverse has Heracles wearing the pelt of the Numidian lion, and the reverse has Zeus sitting on his throne, holding his scepter and his eagle. Interestingly, the mint location of my coin is actually unknown, but numismatists speculate the city of Side. There are many die types, and this style of coinage lasted for centuries after his death, because Alexander was such an important figure in the eyes of all Greeks that followed. One of the best die types is from Ptolemy I Soter, who ended up taking Egypt. The one you're seeing on screen now was minted in Memphis, a truly spectacular piece. Alexander and his successors also looted a ton of gold as well. There's a metric ton of these gold staters that still survive today, and even rarer die staters, which is worth 2 of them. The one you're seeing now is the most beautifully and masterly engraved die type for this coin that I've ever seen. Interestingly, this is minted by Pyrrhus of Epirus, who is one of the most famous Greek generals. We get the term Pyrrhic victory from him because he fought Rome and would win the battle, but at an unsustainable cost that eventually made him lose the war overall. Like I said, the Alexander the Great tetradrachms was very influential, like the Athens tetradrachm, that other civilizations started imitating it. The most famous is the Celtic imitations, which I made a video on, so please check that out after this. Another civilization is the Arabian tribes. I picked this die type as I find it very interesting, and I wish I could tell you more about this coin, but there's so very little information on it. Let's move on to one of the Diadochi who I already mentioned, Ptolemy I Soter in Egypt. He needed to solidify his rule, so he associated himself with Alexander and minted these very interesting coins. The obverse is actually Alexander himself. He is wearing the skin of the elephant, as you can see, the ears and the trunk. This is an obvious inspiration of the coins of Alexander minted of Heracles. The reverse has Athena holding her spear. Eventually, Ptolemy was comfortable enough to mint his image of himself on the coins, which would be the standard for all future Ptolemaic tetradrachms until Cleopatra. He and his later dynasty members would mint these interesting bronze pieces. They could be anywhere from 10 grams to a whopping 100 plus grams. I purposely didn't add many bronze coins to this video because I wanted to eventually do a dedicated video on Greek bronze coins. Another Diadochi that we will look at is Lysimachus. He was the king of Thrace. He also needed to solidify his rule, and he associated himself with Alexander like Ptolemy did. He made these very sought-after tetradrachms of Alexander wearing the horns of Ammon. When Alexander fought his way to Egypt, the Egyptians welcomed him as a liberator because of the cruel Persian treatment. He talked to the oracle as Siwa and was hailed the son of Zeus Ammon, a hybrid of the Egyptian deity Ammon and, of course, Zeus. The reverse has Athena on a throne holding Nike or victory, crowning the name of Lysimachus. Very interesting propaganda that would influence many coins for centuries, including coins of Britannia 2 millennium later. Unfortunately, Lysimachus eventually lost his kingdom and would end with the death of himself. I'm going to start wrapping this up as this video is pretty long, but I wanted to mention a few civilizations that were influenced by the Greeks and then end with the Hellenistic period. The most famous of the non-Greeks are the Carthaginians. They were part of Punic origin, meaning they are Semitic peoples that originated from the Levant, most notably in the city of Tyre. They started colonizing parts of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula in the 9th century BC. They are most famous with their wars against Rome. There was 3 wars called the Punic Wars. I will start with the earlier coins. They meant these in the fights in Sicily. You'll typically see the goddess Tanit, Dido, and Melkart. Dido is supposedly the first queen and the founder of Carthage. Tanit is a Carthaginian goddess, and Melkart is the Punic personification of Heracles. All of the early coins use the Greek weight standard. During the First Punic War, they switched to a Punic standard. The piece you're seeing now is a 5 shekel piece, which weighs around 30 grams in weight, which is a pretty big coin. The next is a second Punic War issue piece. One you're seeing now is a standard shekel, but looks quite good for only being 22 millimeters in diameter. Quite a bit of earlier coins still survive today, and the Punic War ones are available as well, but a little bit more scarce. They all tend to be in high quality, probably because there's a lot of turmoil going on, so people hoarded these away. The first I want to mention is the Parthians. They are most famous from the constant rivalry between them and Rome, but they were established a couple hundred years before the wars between them. The Parthians came from the Parni tribe, a nomadic group of people who originated from the steppes around the 240s BC. They started to carve into the Seleucid and Greco-Bactrian kingdoms and eventually established themselves. The most notable of the early Parthians was Mithridates I. He was the one who took Parthia from a small kingdom to conquering much of Mesopotamia, including Babylon, to form a major player that was there to stay until the Sasanians much later. He is most famous for capturing the Seleucid king Demetrius II Nicator, causing mass turmoil for the Seleucids that they could never recover from. Here's a tetradrachm of Mithridates I. It looks basically like a normal Greek coin. He is wearing a diadem, which is worn by the Greek kings, and even Heracles on the reverse. Early coins have an obvious Hellenistic art and influence, and it would change to their own artistic twist at a later date as the Greeks eventually faded into history. Another region that was under the Greek influence was the Kingdom of Armenia. After Alexander's conquest, it was typically part of the Seleucids but remained autonomous. By far the most famous Armenian king was Tigranes II, or Tigranes the Great, during the later half of the period. The Seleucids were basically a small state at this point, and Armenia started greatly expanding during his reign. He allied himself with Mithridates the Sixth Eupator of Pontus, who I didn't mention, but a popular figure during the time period, to fight Rome, which they eventually lost. Tigranes tetradrachms used to be rare, but a hoard was found, and now they're pretty abundant in many grades. Interestingly, it has both Persian and Greek influence on his coins, with Tigranes wearing the Armenian royal clothing, and the reverse has Tyche, a patron deity of Antioch, which he managed to capture the city during his reign. A pretty cool coin to collect if you like cultural hybridization types of coins with an interesting history. Next is 2 kind of forgotten, looked over places during the Hellenistic age, and that is both Numidia and Nabatea. These 2 civilizations were between the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt. Numidia played a large role in the Punic Wars, providing their famous cavalry that was deadly on the battlefield. Then you have the Nabateans, which is most famous for their capital city, Petra, which is a famous tourist destination that is known for its buildings cut from the face of giant cliff sides. I'll put up on screen a couple coins of each place. As you can see, the obvious Hellenistic influence, whether it's Greek diadem on the kings, an eagle, or columns on the temple. That's why they are classified as Greek coins. One very quick mention is the Jews during the ancient time period. We have the Jewish wars against Vespasian, the soon-to-be Roman emperor. The Jews lost and the Second Temple was destroyed. And then you have the Bar Kokhba revolt when Hadrian was emperor. Again, the Jews lost and Jerusalem was renamed. These coins are fascinating and they deserve their own video. These are considered Greek coins, which I'm not really sure why, because this is much after during the Hellenistic age. But when I make a dedicated video, I will do my research. I'm going to wrap this up with the Ptolemies. Arguably the most famous woman in the ancient world, Cleopatra. Interestingly, she broke away with the typical coin types with the obverse being Ptolemy I Soter, but she kept the reverse with the eagle. Silver must have been an issue because there are extremely few coins of her portrait that are in silver that does not have Mark Antony on it. Her bronze coins are pretty common, but they tend to be pretty worn, and they still command a decent price. Her defeat in 30 BC marks the end of the Greeks, as the Hellenistic kings were either already absorbed or vassals of a bigger power like Rome or Parthia. But a little known fact, there was one more kingdom that was independent for another 40 years, and the very far eastern part of the Greek influence was the Indo-Greeks. I purposely did not mention them, as the Greco-Bactrians and Indo-Greeks deserve their own video. Alexander fought into India and most famously known for defeating King Porus, but Alexander's conquered territory never vanished after he left to go back to Macedon, but ultimately died in Babylon. A lot of his land was captured by the Guptas, but the Greeks reclaimed the land. Without going into much detail, a lot of Indo-Greek kings are completely unknown to us except for their coinage. The last Indo-Greek king was Strato II and his son Strato III. They managed to hold until around 10 AD. Here's my coin, a tiny dram of Strato II. He typically looks like an old man, but this must have been one of his earlier issues as he looks pretty young. It is very crude on both sides, and the reverse has Athena holding the thunderbolt with an Indian inscription around the edges. I find this part of the world during the Hellenistic age the most intriguing for myself, as most people don't even know the Greeks were in India, and for how much that we don't know about them. There are so many coins that I passed over, but this video would be over an hour long. Thank you guys for sticking around, and if you like this video, please let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for more coin videos, as I want to dive into more topics, whether it's Roman Republican, Roman Imperial, or even more Greek coinage. And if you have a video request, please leave a comment. Again, thank you guys for watching, and take care.